Elden Ring just had a really big update which fixed and balanced a whole bunch of weapons, incantations and even spells, meaning that there are now even more ways to create some ridiculously powerful builds. And of course today I'm going to be showing you 5 more incredibly powerful and stupidly fun builds to use in Elden Ring so that you can have an absolute blast as you destroy everything in the latest update. So without wasting any more of your time, let's just jump straight into this top 5 video. Just a quickly note before we delve into it though, the gameplay that you're going to be seeing in the background is from different characters and they were in New Game Plus 2 and New Game Plus 3 respectively, so just bear that in mind when you're seeing the numbers that we're going to be doing with the various weapons, because of course if you're in a much higher New Game Plus then you might do a little bit less, but of course if you're in your first new game then you of course are going to do a bit more damage than what you're seeing me do. And of course I will also show you where to get said weapons or equipment that you need to obviously make these builds possible. But with that all out of the way, we can obviously jump straight into the first build that I want to talk about today, and that is going to be a build that I am calling the SwordMaster. And as you can hopefully see by the character in the background, that heavily revolves around the new Great Katana that was added in the DLC. Great Katanas are very quickly becoming one of my favourite weapon types because although they're a lot slower than their much smaller counterparts being regular katanas, they of course make up for that by hitting your enemies like an absolute truck, and of course have really good range and a whole bunch of stance damage to go with it. Now obviously just to show you where you can get the Great Katana, it is in this lake just west of the Great Bridge North site of Grace in the DLC, and it is residing on this body just in front of the Ghost Flame Dragon in this lake. Luckily, even by walking up to it normally, you're not going to wake the dragon up, so you can just go and pick up the weapon, yoink it from the body, and then get yourself back out of there. And when you do that, like I say, you've got an incredible weapon with a lot of versatility, because the best thing about this particular katana is you can change the Ash of War. I personally chose the Giant Hunt Ash of War just because I love that Ash of War, especially when you come up against regular enemies and corpse launch them into oblivion, but you can use any Ash of War that you like. Obviously things like the Savage Lion's Claw got an upgrade in the recent update and is super good, but even things like the regular Lion's Claw or even Wild Strikes are still going to be versatile. Just whatever Ash of War you put on this weapon, I highly recommend that you make it an occult version. That is because this weapon does come with an innate bleed build up, and with a fully upgraded katana along with the stats I'm going to show you in a moment, your bleed proc can be up to 106, which means pretty much every sort of like 3 or 4 hits with this weapon will be proccing bleed. And when you mix that in with the fact that this weapon does thousands of damage anyway just on its own, it's very easy to see why this is so much fun and so powerful. Of course, just so you can mimic the damage that you're seeing on screen for yourself, here are the stats for this character, and as always, it's a level 150 character, and this will be the case for all the other builds going forward as well. But as you can see, we've got 50 points into Vigor, 11 Mind, 24 Endurance, 14 Strength, 18 Dexterity, 9 Intelligence, 33 Faith, and then 70 Arcane. And again, just to explain those stats a little bit more, the starting class with this character was Samurai, but again, you can use any class that you want, because where we turn the weapon into an occult variant, we of course want to pump everything that we can into Arcane to both boost our AR and also that bleed proc I mentioned earlier. But you do need at least 14 Strength and 18 Dexterity just to wield the weapon, as that's the minimum requirements for it. And then the reason why we got 33 Faith is so that we can run both Golden Vow and Howl of Shibiri to give us the damage boost with both of those respective incantations. But of course, if you're delving into a much higher level, I highly recommend just pumping your Arcane all the way up to 80, as that will be the final soft cap, before then delving more into Vigor and then just pumping up your Strength and Dexterity to boost the AR as much as possible. But even if you stick with the stats I've showed you for the level 150 character, you're still going to be doing monstrous damage, which is also being helped by the armor that we're using, because again, for those of you that don't know, the Rakshasa armor that I'm currently rocking does also boost your overall damage output, and that's for all damage types, by 2% for each piece of the armor that you wear. So essentially the full set will give you a plus 8% to your overall damage output, but again, feel free to wear whichever armor you want. But one thing I highly recommend that you keep the same are going to be the talismans, and I'm just going to throw them up on screen for you, so again, feel free to pause the video, jot these down. But we are going to be using the Shard of Alexander, again with my specific Ash of War Giant's Hunt on this build. It is just a one trick use, like there's no charge up or anything like that, so whenever we use that attack with the Shard of Alexander, we're getting a plus 15% to our overall damage output. But then I also highly recommend running the Axe Talisman, because again, charged heavies are going to be your best friend with this weapon, because like I say, that will deal a butt ton of damage and a butt ton of stance damage, and with the Axe Talisman you'll be getting a plus 10% damage whenever you use those types of moves. But then I also recommend running the Lord of Blood's Exaltation, because again, whenever a bleed proc occurs, which is quite often with this build, you will then be getting a further 20% damage boost for 30 seconds. And then for your final talisman, I highly recommend you use the two-handed talisman, because again, whenever you two-hand this weapon, you will then have an extra 15% extra damage boost, and because of that, I highly recommend that you two-hand this weapon all the time. And then just to finish off this build, in the Wonder Physic, I highly recommend that you run the Stone Barb Crack tier, as well as the Spiked Crack tier, just again to boost your stance damage, as well as your charged heavy attacks, because as I say, other than the Ash of War, your charged heavies are going to be the thing that's going to be doing the most damage with this weapon, and with everything combined in this build, you'll be breaking your enemies' poises very quickly, applying bleed very quickly, ultimately meaning that you'll destroy everything very quickly. But as much as this build is amazing, I know it's not for everybody, but if you're a fan of doing say 5,000-6,000 or even more damage per hit, then let me introduce you to a build that I'm calling the Carian Knight 2.0, because yes, this build is going to be revolved completely around Carian Sovereignty. Carian Sovereignty is basically Carian Grandeur's much bigger and better brother, and is actually the move that Rolana uses on us that borderline wipes away our entire health bar. Now this is an Ash of War, and it can be applied to pretty much any basic greatsword in the entire game, and to find this Ash of War you do actually need to make your way to the Cathedral of Magnus Meteor, but if you come to the Church District High Road site of Grace just before the cathedral, you can basically wrap around the outside of this little cliff that the cathedral is sitting on, and by following this outer path you will then come to this sort of like little opening in the rock face, and hiding above you in this cave will be the silver scarab, or the blue scarab I should say, that is holding the Ash of War. Of course, just bring a ranged weapon or even just some throwing knives to knock the scarab down, and upon defeating it you will then get the Carian Sovereignty. And like I say, this is basically the Carian Nightsword, or more specifically Carian Grandeur on crack. But as much as it does so much damage as well as a whole bunch of poise damage, it does have a pretty big drawback, which is of course taking the time that it does to wind up said attack. Now you can charge this or do a quicker release, with the quicker release obviously doing a little less damage, but for a full wind up of this attack it does sort of take about 5 seconds or so, so if you're up against a much more mobile enemy it can be a little bit tricky to obviously pull the full thing off, which is why I highly recommend that you pair this Ash of War with Freya's Curved Greatsword. This again is a brand new curved sword that was introduced in the DLC, and you do need to complete Freya's questline to get it, and if you don't know how to do that, I'll leave a link to my questline video in the description down below, because for those fights where you can't pull off the full attack of the Ash of War, you can just use this incredible greatsword to again deal thousands of damage, and when you apply the Ash of War on this weapon you can also make it a cold affinity, which will allow you to apply frostbite to your enemies as well. But of course, to mimic the crazy damage that you're seeing on screen, I highly recommend that you run these following stats. And again, as you can see, we've got 50 points into Vigor, 12 Mind, 26 Endurance, 59 Strength, 14 Dexterity, 25 Intelligence, 33 Faith, and then 10 Arcane. Now the starting character with this one is actually a Wretch, which is why my base stats are 10, so basically don't put anything into Arcane. But with the weapon and also the Ash of War, they do scale with Strength. The Ash of War does have a better scaling with Intelligence, mind you, but as you're seeing, even if we do just put most of our stuff into Strength, it still does a monstrous amount of damage. And again, where we've got 33 points into Faith, that will allow us to run both Golden Vow and Hal Shabiri again, and by having 25 points worth of intelligence we can boost that with a few things, much like our Wonder Physic, to allow us to have a catalogue of different spells like Great Blade Phalanx to again deal even more poise damage and just give a bit more versatility into this build. And talking of the Wonder Physic, I highly recommend inside that you use the Intelligence Not tier to, like I say, boost your intelligence by plus 10 with that particular tier, but then I also recommend running the Magic Shrouding Crack tier, because again that will heavily boost the damage output with the Ash of War, as well as any spells that you want to use with this build. And for those of you that are also probably wondering about what staff to use, essentially you can use any staff that you like. I believe in the gameplay I was just using the simple Astrologer's staff, as like I say I was just purely focusing on the Ash of War for this particular build. And then with the armor, I was actually wearing Rolana's armor, but it still kept with the theme of being that Carian Knight. And of course, to finalize this build, the talismans that I recommend that you run are going to be the following. So again, we've got ourselves the Godfrey's icon to boost our damage output whenever we charge our Ash of War, along with any chargeable spells that we can use as well. But then we've also got the Shard of Alexander, again just to give us a flat boost with our Ash of War specifically, before then using the Magic Scorpion Charm to again boost our overall damage output by 12% with any magic based attacks, and again finalizing this particular build with the two-handed talisman, because again that will give you a plus 15% boost whenever you're two-handing your main weapon. Like I said at the beginning, you can use any greatsword that you like, and essentially by putting this Ash of War on that weapon with a cold infusion, the frost build-up is actually going to be around 127. That's as long as the weapon is fully upgraded. So much like our previous build, you'll be proccing frostbite sort of every 3 or 4 hits with that main weapon. But no matter what weapon you end up using with this particular build, I highly recommend that you try out the Carian Sovereignty, because it is stupidly powerful, and is also really satisfying when you get the full thing off. But talking about satisfying, that is exactly the word I would use when describing our next build, because for our third build today, I want to bring you the Royal Guard. So we are going to be keeping with a similar theme, but the Royal Guard actually revolves around Milady, and more specifically Milady with the Wing Stance Ash of War. And again, this combination is of course well known in the community because it absolutely destroys pretty much everything. Light Greatswords also got a bit of a buff during the recent updates, as the Light Greatsword's charged attacks have had an increase in their damage animation, which for me and you means better staggers and poise damage. So a weapon that was already destroying everything but was a little bit lackluster in terms of the stance damage has now had an upgrade in that, making it possibly one of the most well-rounded weapons in the entire game. And when you combine that with one of the more powerful Ashes of Wars in Wing Stance, it's just an extremely deadly combination. And of course, to get both the Ash of War and the weapon itself, they are actually both residing in Castle Insis, which is where Rolana is located in the DLC. The weapon itself, Milady, is actually just right at the front, so as soon as you have access to the castle front site of Grace, you can basically walk over the bridge, head left past the massive troll, and again if you keep hanging left, so instead of going through the cave, go up the staircase instead, and again up the ladder, and inside the chest at the top of the tower will be the Milady weapon. But for the Wing Stance Ash of War, you do actually need to progress through Castle Insis, and more specifically just outside of the boss arena, coming to the Castle Lord's Chamber site of Grace. And if you head out to this balcony, you can actually hop over the ledge to the little area down below, and again by going through this tower and going up the ladders, there will be a chest at the very top, where again inside that chest will be the Ash of War. Now, when you put the Ash of War on Milady, I highly recommend that you make it a quality version, so you get a B-rated scaling in both strength and dexterity, and then on top of having brilliant scalings in 2 stats, it also keeps the weapon open for things like greases and weapon attunements, so things like Bloodflame Blade, and that is exactly what I recommend that you use with this weapon, because not only will you get an additional amount of fire damage, but you'll also have the lingering bleed build-up that comes with the Bloodflame Blade. So essentially you'll be doing thousands of damage with its quick attacks, as well as breaking your enemies' poises relatively quickly and bleed build-up. Again, I know a lot of you will probably already be aware of the powers of Milady and this type of build, but it's something that I have yet to cover on the channel, and if you by chance don't know about Milady, you need to get to know about it, because as I'm sure you're probably seeing in the background, it's just an absolute monster. And of course, to mimic the damage that we're doing with this monster, I recommend that you run these following stats. So again, you got 50 vigor, 10 mind, 21 endurance, 50 strength, 53 dexterity. I know the screenshot might say 58, but that's being boosted by one of the talismans we'll come to in a moment, before then finishing it off with 10 intelligence, 25 faith, and then 10 arcane. Again, 25 faith will allow us to use both flame grant me strength as well as golden vow, which is more than enough for this build. And as I mentioned earlier, we've got a B rated in both strength and dexterity. This was kind of like the best distribution that I could get in terms of an AR with both of those stats, which can of course be boosted even more if you're in a much higher level, and just basically put both of these to 80. But as for the armor, again, you can see we're using the Carian Knight armor in its fullest. I believe actually I swapped out the gauntlets and the greaves for scaled gauntlets and greaves just to give me a little bit more poise and a little bit more protection. But other than that, I also was running these following talismans, and again, where we're going to be utilizing the winged stance as much as we can. The Shard of Alexander will be our best friend, as again, we'll get our plus 15% boost whenever we use that particular attack, but we can also pair that with one of of the new talismans being Rolana's cameo, because when we use the wing stance we can actually hold our Ash of War button and stay in that stance for as long as we need to, and by staying in that stance for 2 seconds we will then get a boost of plus 15% to our damage output when we then go and attack our enemies. But then I would also finish off this build with both Millicent's prosthesis and also the Rotten Winged Insignia, and like I mentioned earlier, Millicent's prosthesis will give us a plus 5 to dexterity, which is amazing for this particular weapon, and both of them will be giving us respective boosts to successive damage output, which is very easy to do with this particular weapon type. And then to finish off the build, I would highly recommend that you run the Thorny crack tier as well as the Stone Barb crack tier inside of your Wonder Physic to give us a third boost to successive damage output, as well as making it even easier to break our enemy stances, and essentially no matter what enemy you come up against you will destroy them either just with the pure damage output as we're getting the buffs with the successive damage, or you'll be breaking their stance really quickly, and again you'll just be able to have loads of critical hits. And if your enemies are really unfortunate, they will also be taking a whole bunch of bleed build up and bleed damage through the Blood Flame Blade. So as I say, the Milady is an absolute monster. It's extremely versatile and very, very fun to use, and if you haven't used it already, definitely make sure you go out and use it now. But of course, saying that, we've still got 2 more builds to go over, and they're actually still really, really exciting builds. And the next one I want to showcase to you guys is actually going to be the Death Knight build. And as the name suggests, this is a build tailored around the Death Knight weapons and also incantations. Now, Death Knights are actually a brand new mini-boss that have been introduced in the game, and there's 2 of them in their respective catacombs. But for this specific build, we want to be using the Twin Axes, as they have a very unique Blink Bolt Ash of War, being fittingly named the Twin Axe, which has 2 phases, the first of which allows you to move forward, similar to that of a quick step, but actually gives you iframes as you disappear. And then if you follow up with a heavy attack, you then hurl yourself forward towards your enemies in a corkscrew motion, which deals multiple attacks and can deal thousands of damage in very, very quick succession. The boss you need to kill to get this specific weapon is actually hiding away in Fog Rift Catacombs, and you can get here straight away from loading up the DLC. I'm just going to show you the location here on the map, but I won't spoil the boss fight for you. But then for those of you that are also keen-eyed, you've probably seen that we're using the Death Knight armor as well. So this is what the boss will look like when you eventually fight him. But this armor is hidden away in a completely different catacomb, which is the Dark Light Catacombs. Now, I'm just going to show you how you actually get this armor, because it is a little bit tricky to explain, but essentially you do need to progress through that particular catacomb until you get to sort of like this room, which you can indeed light up using this lever. And instead of progressing forward as normal going down the staircase, you will actually notice there is a very, very small gap in the railing, which if you use that gap to drop down, you will then come to this hidden room with this body, which is again another Death Knight, and by pillaging the body you will get your very own Death Knight armor. So yes, just make sure you go through the Dark Light Catacombs, come to that area, drop down onto that ledge, and this will be yours. And the reason why I'm suggesting this armor set is not only because it looks really cool, but it also gives a plus 2% extra damage boost to the Blink Bolt Ashes of War for each piece of armor that we wear. So essentially by wearing the full set we get a plus 8% overall damage output with this particular weapon, and as you've been seeing with the gameplay in the background, they absolutely shred if you can get the tracking right. It is a little bit finicky with some enemies because again the more mobile enemies might be able to dodge this particular attack, but if you basically brute force this and use the Blink Bolt to be right in front of your enemy before then using that charged corkscrew attack, that will basically allow you to hit more often or not and have a much better success of getting the full move off, as if you were to use it from range and say give them enough space to dodge out the way. But again, to mimic the damage that you're seeing on screen with this particular build, here are the stats for it. And again, we've got 50 points into vigor, 11 mind, 21 endurance, 54 strength, 40 dexterity, 9 intelligence, 36 faith, and 8 arcane. Again, this particular character is a samurai character, so our arcane, intelligence, and mind have not been touched. And I know the scalings of the weapon would suggest otherwise, but it's actually beneficial for us to delve more into strength, which is why I've delved a few more points into that over dexterity, as that will actually be the best combination to get the best AR with this particular weapon. And the reason why I've pumped up faith a little bit more to have 36 points worth of faith is so that we can use the brand new Knight's Lightning Strike Ash of War, as that can also be extremely punishing with its high amount of damage and relatively high amount of poise damage too. But again, much like the other builds, I was mainly focusing on the weapon, and to get the best damage out of the weapon itself, I highly recommend running these talismans. So again, we've got the Shard of Alexander to boost our damage output whenever we use the Ash of War, but again, we've also got Millicent's Prosthesis and the Rotten Winged Insignia to again give us a +5 to dexterity, as well as to boost the successive damage output, which does get triggered by the Ash of War, by the way, before then finishing off with the Lightning Scorpion Charm, because again, everything that we're doing pretty much with this build does also have some form of lightning damage tied to it. And then for the Wonder Physic, I highly recommend that you run both the Thorny Crack tier and the Lightning Shrouding Crack tier, because again, that will give us our third boost to successive damage output, which is monstrous whenever we're using the Ash of War. And then, like I say, because pretty much every attack that we're doing has some form of lightning damage, the Lightning Shrouding Crack tier will just boost our overall damage output by 20%. And of course, when you eventually get the timing down with this weapon, it is extremely deadly and super fun and super satisfying to pull off that incredible Ash of War. Or in worst case scenario, you can rely on the incantations like the Knight's Lightning Strike or even the Ancient Dragon's Lightning Strike to just obliterate enemies with those instead. So yes, this build will have you covered no matter which way you want to go with it. And as I say, although it's a little bit challenging, it is really fun to use. But of course, with that said, that leaves us with our final build of the video, and it is one that I am calling the Lord of Light, because yes, this build revolves around the Euporia. It's a weapon that is kind of infamous in the community, especially before the update, because it was supposed to be this grand new twin blade that had an incredible Ash of War that transformed this weapon into an absolute beast. But that just really wasn't the case before the update, because it took forever to charge the weapon up and actually use said Ash of War. But now they fixed it where you can actually charge it much quicker, and the Ash of War does more damage, and it lasts even longer than what it did before. Now again, I'm just going to show you how you get this weapon, and it is a bit of a convoluted route, because you can actually only obtain this weapon when you obtain access to Inner Illum. And again, without spoiling anything, that is the final area of the game, and you do need to come to the Spiral Rise Site of Grace, and I'm just going to show you the route on screen. Basically, there's a bunch of secret jumps you can do onto various staircases and even round certain sides of the actual structure itself. Just be careful and bring a relatively okay build, maybe one of the previous builds, because there are going to be a bunch of enemies that you need to kill. But essentially, by taking a sequence of lifts down to the next respective areas, you will end up on this pathway with a sealed door at the end, and by opening up that sealed door, you will then be able to pick up the Euporia from this body. And like I was mentioning earlier, the unique thing about this weapon is that you can actually charge up its Ash of War. There are 2 stages for the Ash of War, and after about 5 hits, you will have charged it up to its first stage, and if you do a further 5 more hits with the base weapon itself, you will then charge it up to its second stage. Now, just to also give you a bit of information about this charge up, when you do enough hits to initially charge the weapon into its first phase of the Ash of War, so it starts glowing for the first time, you will actually be doing a certain amount of additional holy damage, which of course helps with the AR of the weapon, which again gets boosted when you charge up the Ash of War to its second phase and the light becomes much brighter. So in actual fact, it is sometimes better just to leave this glow on the weapon and not use the Ash of War straight away, as each attack that you will be doing with this weapon when it's fully charged will be doing around about 100 more damage with that additional holy damage, which, as you can see from the gameplay, allows you to deal thousands and thousands of damage very, very quickly. But of course, when you have this weapon fully charged, the Ash of War is very damning, as it will shoot rays of light at your enemies, dealing again a tremendous amount of holy damage as well as a load of poise damage, and depending on the enemy you're fighting, can even push them to the ground or make them stagger, leaving them open for yet another couple of attacks. So like I say, it's best to use this weapon just sort of like as a base twin blade for the most part, and then choose your timing correctly to then unleash the full power of the Ash of War, because again, you do move a bit slowly when you do use it, and if you're coming up against a bigger enemy or most of the bosses, they can actually hit you and stagger you out of the Ash of War. So like I say, just be careful when using this weapon and definitely try and get the timings down. But of course, to mimic the crazy damage that we're currently doing, here are the stats for the build. And again, we've got 50 points into Vigor, 11 mind, 21 endurance, 35 strength, 25 dexterity, 9 intelligence, 70 faith, and 8 arcane. And yes, this weapon predominantly scales with faith and then has 2 secondary attributes in both strength and dexterity. But not only this, if you don't want to just purely focus on the weapon for your damage output, by having 70 faith in the build, that will pretty much allow you to use any incantation in the entire game. And with things like Rain of Fire getting the buff that it's got recently and is just absolutely devastating and borderline broken now, you can also apply things like that to the build to give you even more range and even more damage output if the weapon wasn't good enough already. But for the weapon itself, I do recommend that you run these following talismans. And again, we've got the combination of the Millicent's prosthesis and the Rotten Wing insignia to give us again a +5 to dexterity and 2 boosts to our successive damage output. But then I also highly recommend that you run the Shard of Alexander to boost your damage when you do use that Ash of War, before then finishing it off with the two-handed talisman to again give us a +15% boost to our overall damage output whenever we're two-handing the weapon, which should be pretty much all the time. And then in the Wonder Physic, I highly recommend that you run both the Faith Knot tier to boost your faith up to that soft cap of 80, as well as the Thorny Crack tier to give our third boost to successive damage output, which again is a huge contributing factor as to why we're doing so much damage with this weapon. This weapon is extremely fun to use. It's also really satisfying watching the weapon charge up and obviously glow as you deal more damage, and although it wasn't really all that good before, it's definitely much more usable now, and it's definitely worth trying again if you're thinking of doing so in the latest update. And I guess with all that said, that concludes this top 5 list. So yeah, there you have it. That is my sort of top 5 builds that I'm currently using in Elden Ring as of the 1.13 update. But I want to know from you guys, do you agree that these are super fun and super powerful builds? Obviously, let me know in the comments, and even let me know what your top 5 builds are right now. I know a lot of you are probably wondering, well, where's things like the Blood Fiend's arm and other weapons like that, but we have actually covered those weapons already on this channel extensively in multiple videos actually. So this was just another 5 incredibly powerful builds I wanted to bring you that we haven't actually covered yet. So hopefully I've brought you something that's fun and enjoyable and new for you guys to use. And if you have enjoyed this video in any way, if you don't mind me asking you just to leave a like rating down below, it would help out the channel tremendously, but it's also the quickest way to let me know that you enjoy these top 5s and you maybe want to see more top 5s in the future. But as I say, we've covered many builds in the past, and we're going to continue to cover more incredible weapons. So if you want to stay up to date with all of the latest Elden Ring stuff, make sure that you're also subscribed if you haven't subscribed already. We're also super close to 30,000 subscribers, so if you want to help us get to that mark, like I say, hit that subscribe button down below. It's free to do, and you'll stay up to date with all of the videos that come out on this channel. Other than that, I think I have said more than enough for this video. Go and have an absolute blast with these builds, and of course feel free to let me know how you get on if you do happen to use them. But other than that, I hope you're doing well and I hope you're having a fantastic day. But I guess for now, I'll catch you in the next video. Bye bye.